Hello and welcome to another beautiful Friday on Speaking for Him. I'm Dan VanZalen, and here's your host, Andrew Gomison.
Hello, Dan. As those of you who have listened to the podcast for any length of time remember, we had a regular feature on this podcast for a number of years called the Speaking for Him Book Club. Now, responsibilities and life has gotten in the way of Naomi joining me and Denise, who joined us for a couple. They are not able to be a part of it. So the book club, as we knew it, kind of went into the past, and you can listen to those book club episodes in the archives at any time. But what I thought I would do today is, last January, I got the idea to write down every book that I read in 2019. So as I finished a book, I would add it to the list. And I got to the end of the year a few days ago, and I found out, after totaling them up, that I read 44 books, I believe, in 2019.
Aw, here I thought you read 60.
That's the goal for next year. No, the goal is just to continue to read and see where I end up. I'm not really big into putting goals on that, because it also, the thing about books is it sometimes depends on the length of the book. Like if all the books I read were the size of the book I read on Ulysses S. Grant, then I might only get to a dozen in a year, because that one took me like 3 months to read.
It was also probably super dry and about 1,200 pages long.
It wasn't necessarily dry, but I'm the type of reader that kind of, if I get bogged down in a book, even if it's a good book, it kind of gets discouraging.
Yep.
So I really had to keep just plowing on for that. But I'm just going to give you 5 titles that stick out from that book list and tell you a little bit about each of them. 15 Minutes by Karen Kingsbury. I like to read Karen. She's a very good contemporary Christian fiction writer. And she's very good at painting pictures and at having deep characters. And this one also resonated with me because it dealt with a crisis pregnancy. And I have long been a pro-life advocate and really want to encourage people in practical ways to choose life. We're about that time in the year where we are celebrating the anniversary of the Roe versus Wade decision that legalized those abortions and have caused the death of well over 60 million unborn children. So this is an issue that is clearly important to me. And the reason that I resonated with it was because I just saw how people pouring into this girl's life helped her to be able to choose life. And it also helped her to not have to deal with the trauma of choosing abortion, and also helped her to put a baby in the arms of a family that desperately wanted a family.
So what's the significance behind the title?
So 2 weeks was really the time that I said 15 minutes, didn't I? I have the wrong title on here. It was 2 weeks. 2 weeks is the title. I have 15 minutes in my notes. Another good book by Karen Kingsbury, but I don't know why I had that in there. But the significance of the 2 weeks was that from the time an adoption was arranged, in this particular adoption agency, the adoptive parent had 2 weeks to decide to change their mind, or the person putting their baby up for adoption had 2 weeks to decide to change their mind. So the adoptive parents had to wait 2 weeks and kind of white knuckle it and pray that God would allow them to have the baby. And it was even more significant because something happened with the foster care of the baby where it didn't work out. So they gave the baby to the prospective adoptive family for the 2 week duration where they were waiting to see if they could adopt the baby. So they were at risk of being attached to the baby and then having to give it up. And even though this was a fictional account, it was based in truth from what I've read about where the author got the story. So 2 Weeks is the name of that first book. The second book is one of those long books that I was telling you about, and that is Martin Luther by Eric Metaxas. Again, this is a very long book. I listened to it on audio, and I think it was a little bit over 20 hours, perhaps 22 hours. And so it was quite the commitment, but I did think it was worth it. It gave me insight into Martin Luther in a way that I had never thought of him before. It kind of dispelled some of the rumors about Martin Luther, and I think I mentioned on a previous podcast how even Luther didn't like people being referred to as Lutherans, which I found particularly interesting. And if you really want to be challenged in your faith and just hear a lot of what Martin Luther thought about a lot of different things, reading Martin Luther by Eric Metaxas will be good. And if you listen to the audiobook, he reads it. And sometimes authors reading their own material can be a nightmare, but he's actually a narrator as well as an author. So
that's nice.
And then the third title I have here is Prison Saved My Life by Lewis Dooley. And in our discussions off mic, it appears that both Dan and myself have heard him speak at our churches. To give a short story of Lewis, he was given 2 life sentences plus 100 years for the attempted murder of someone, and then by the grace of God, became a believer shortly after he went to prison, and then was given parole. And then after being on parole for about a year or two, they said he no longer had to report for parole. It was originally going to be like until 2039, if I'm remembering correctly, or later, that he was going to be on parole. Like it was going to be a long period of time.
Uh-huh.
And it was only a few years, I think, out of prison that they released him from those conditions and said, you're no longer on parole. And the significance of that was that he was involved in a prison ministry and he wasn't allowed to come back to the prison as a visiting speaker until he was off parole.
Oh.
So it was really a miracle of God that he was able to get off parole and be able to become full-time with Set Free Ministries, which is what eventually, I believe, led him to write the book. And one of the most interesting stories to me in that book was that he met and started dating his wife while he was in prison.
Huh.
And I believe he even proposed to her before he got out.
Oh, wow.
So that is kind of interesting, kind of insane in a good way. And just interesting how God worked in his life, and so definitely worth reading.
Oh, yeah. Now I know I recognize his name from, I've heard him referenced by 2 different people. One is, and now I've lost the names. Oh, well.
Okay. And then I have The Good Neighbor by Maxwell King, and this is a book about Fred Rogers, who is known affectionately by children of all ages for the last 50 or so years as Mr. Rogers. And it was just interesting to read a full-length biography about him. He never wanted a biography written while he was alive because he was a humble guy who didn't think he was that great. He was just trying to help kids.
Uh-huh.
But after he had died, one of the people that worked for his nonprofit organization said there really needs to be a book written about Fred so that his legacy gets passed on, so that people don't forget about him and don't forget about the things that were important to him. And Fred Rogers' wife said, well, if you're so dead set that there needs to be a book, why don't you write it? So Maxwell King wrote this book, and it was very entertaining and interesting. So that's 4 titles from my 2019 book list, and I'm throwing in a 5th as a bonus that I actually read in 2018, and that was called Fearless by Sadie Robertson. And I downloaded it from my local Overdrive website, and I just thought, it'll be a quick read. I don't know how much I'll get out of it, but the Robertsons are a little bit intriguing, and so I'll just see what it's about. And if I don't like it that much, it's a short read, so it won't be that big a deal. It was probably the most affecting book to me that I read in 2018. It was short and to the point, but it really talked about her fears and anxieties and what happened in her life when she allowed them to control her, and what happened in her life when she let go and let God take them over. And I would recommend it to anyone who wants to get a boost and wants to embrace the fact that God does not want us to live in fear. So those are just some book selections that I have been benefited by, and I hope that you will find some blessing in them. I plan to continue the practice of keeping track of my reading in 2020, so I'll probably do another podcast like this next January, and hopefully give you some worthwhile titles for my personal reading that will help you to be built up spiritually and to be entertained as well. So that's about all I have time for right now. So I'll just say quickly, have a great weekend and keep serving the best of masters.
Thank you for listening to today's episode. Your host has been Andrew Gomison, founder of Speaking for Him. For more information on today's show and to leave us comments and voicemails, visit speakingforhim.blogspot.com. You can find Andrew's ministry at speakingforhim.com. That's speaking, 4, HIM. You can also interact with us at facebook.com/speakingforhim and on Twitter @SpeakingForHim. And when you look for us on iTunes and Stitcher, let us know what you think of the podcast by leaving a rating and review.